Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for Regen Brisbane's Community Forum. Probably the first, we hope, in a series of discussions about what is going to happen with the 2032 Olympics and what impact will it have on Brisbane and the surrounding region, and in what direction do we want as community members these kinds of large initiatives to take. So in a moment, I'll introduce our lovely guest speakers. But first, I might just introduce Regen Brisbane and tell you a little bit about it in case you're new to all of the good things that we're experimenting with and doing. So hopefully you can still see my screen. Very good. So tonight, we're delighted to have Amy McMahon, the State Member for South Brisbane, Jonathan Shri, Gabba Ward Brisbane City Councillor, and Elise Perups, thank you for waving, from the Queensland Social Enterprise Council, or QSEC. And my lovely co-host, Kira, will be with me to assist with questions and discussions. So if you do have any questions at any time, please do pop them into the chat. So before we begin our discussions, I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the beautiful lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples in North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the remarkable governance system that saw these peoples, the first peoples, care for country and care for each other since time immemorial. And that beautiful photo there are some of the water lilies in the Nudgee waterholes. And I was delighted when I moved to my little suburb of Banyo, that Banyo is the Turrbal word apparently for ridge. And Nudgee Nunda is the Turrbal description of Black Duck Waterhole, which I think is really beautiful. So I'm sure you've all had a very busy day. So why don't you take a big deep breath and have a think about, where you live and work and play, and what it is about Brisbane or our region or wherever you are that you love, and have a think about the things that we all think are precious, because it's the regenerative capacity of the living world and the human beings within this living world that Regen Brisbane is really excited about being part of. So what is Regen Brisbane? Well, it's really just a bubbling up initiative at the moment. We had a bit of a kickoff event last year, which was really fantastic. And because the network is being built by volunteers across a number of organisations, including myself and Kira from the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and James Lee, who's also on this call, but also many other people, too numerous to mention, who've been engaged in the process since we first started exploring it. What Regen Brisbane has been catalysed by are the movements around the world and around Australia, including Regen Melbourne and Regen Sydney, and Regenerative Songlines Australia, which is an Indigenous-led initiative. All of these bubbling up initiatives are connected because people are all talking with each other. And the interest is, how can civil society, and by that I mean folks who aren't necessarily in government, how can people work together to continue doing the good things that folks are already doing across sustainability, local regenerative activities, but really start to deepen our understanding of what a regenerative place can look like. From our point of view, a regenerative city has to be one that starts to really give back to nature and integrate the living world of its natural bioregion in much more significant ways than it does at the moment. But I think here in Australia, we have great opportunities for our towns and cities to be even more excellent than they already are. So if you're interested in Regen Brisbane, we are excited literally next week to be kicking off another series of workshops with the wonderful Elise Perups from QSEC. We'll give that little plug later on. But really, if you're interested in Regen Brisbane, everyone is welcome. Join up to the mailing list. Get in touch. Kira answers a lot of our emails. Yeah, so just join, get in touch. Tell us about what you're already up to. It's about joining up initiatives and really starting to think about how we can transform what we do to make it even better. And in light of that, that's the workshops which I'll come back to, thinking about how we can make our city livable and even better, in light of the fact that Regen Brisbane kind of started to organise its first activities, and then 2 weeks later, it was announced that Brisbane had won the 2032 Olympics. So we all kind of stopped in our tracks and realised this would offer a whole range of challenges, concerns, opportunities. So we're really delighted tonight to start some community conversations about what this could all mean. So I'm not going to chat anymore. As I said, it'd be great if you've got questions, if you could pop them in the chat box as we go. We've invited Amy, Jonathan and Elise to each give a 10 or 15-minute talk about their understanding of what's planned for the Olympics and what's happening, and what they are perhaps themselves involved in, what they are concerned about, and what can we all do next together to play some part in influencing its directions. So, Amy, if you're ready to join us, what I might do is pin you and get rid of myself. There we go. It worked. Are you there, Amy?
I am.
Echo. That was wonderful. It was a bit like the equivalent of a sort of an old Queen video clip. Multiple voices, multiple faces. Well, we're very...
How's that?
Yeah, I think that's better, Amy. I know that you're struggling with the technology, so if you need to mute your other device, that might be the trick.
Yes, that's the trick. I've got that.
Okay, so over to you, Amy. Thank you so much.
Right. Make sure that is muted. Can everyone see me? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Right, great. I did have a slideshow to share.
Sorry, Amy, you'll have to unmute yourself, I think.
How's that?
Yeah, that's much better. Well done.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Got it working. Okay. I did have a bit of a slideshow. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show that just because I'm working, unfortunately, off both my phone and the laptop. So please do excuse some of the technical challenges that I have brought to the meeting tonight. But really pleased to be here. A big thank you to the organising team for inviting me along to talk about what is a really important topic for my neighbourhood and the broader Brisbane area. I'd like to start by acknowledging the rightful owners of the land that I'm gathered on today, that we're all gathered on. I'm on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and would like to pay respects to elders past and present, and remember that sovereignty was never ceded and we meet on stolen land. So as we've heard, Brisbane will be hosting the 2032 Olympic Games very sooner than you think. I think we've got 10 years of a lead up time, but really this is much sooner than we think. We've there's lots of things that are in train at the moment leading up to that. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about was the plans that we know are in place at the moment that the government is thinking through. I wanted to talk through some of the impacts this is having on or is likely to have on the community here, the broader neighbourhood. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work that Jonathan and I have been doing to engage with the community and make sure people are sort of brought along on the journey. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about what other cities are doing to respond to their Olympic Games and see what elements we might be able to borrow for some of the work that we as a community are doing. I'm really pleased that there are other groups like Regen Brisbane who are thinking about what impacts the Olympic Games will have. And I think it's really important that we as a community aren't just uncritically accepting the Olympic Games as what has been sort of branded so far as this amazing thing in terms of the economy and the community, making sure that we're thinking critically about the impacts that the Olympic Games might have. So in terms of the impacts on, in terms of what's planned for the neighbourhood, there's a few different moving parts. Here in South Brisbane, we will be the epicentre and we will have the main stadium, as it is planned at the moment, the main stadium at the Gabba Stadium. The plan is to completely demolish the Gabba Stadium, rebuild a new stadium to accommodate an athletics track and accommodate, I think it's about 8,000 extra seats. And then there's a whole lot of venues right across the city. I'll just read off this list so you get a sense of what's going on. The new Brisbane Arena that will be at Roma Street Parklands will accommodate the swimming and water polo. So Brisbane Arena, if you're not aware, is going to be a big, like an entertainment centre in Roma Street, a very large venue, and they're going to temporarily host a swimming pool there. The aquatic centre will host the diving, water polo and artistic swimming. Down at the South Bank forecourts, they're planning to have archery down there. A Brisbane Indoor Sports Centre, which will be new, will be built for the basketball. Out at the Redlands, they will construct a canoeing canoeing venue. The Athletes Village, will be at Hamilton. The Showgrounds will host the equestrian. Suncorp Stadium will have rugby, and there's a bunch of other venues, but that's just a bit of a taster. Some of these are existing venues. Some of these are new venues as well. And then besides that, there'll also be a bunch of other kind of key infrastructure. There'll be a media centre down at West End, where there's a glass and cardboard factory down there at the moment. So that gives you a bit of a sense of sort of the main infrastructure that is coming in around the Olympic Games. And the way that this has been sort of presented to the community so far is that this is this incredible opportunity to showcase Brisbane to the world, that this will deliver a whole range of economic benefits, will bring a whole lot of tourists and create a whole lot of jobs, a lot of new infrastructure, will bring in a bunch of new public transport that I think Jonathan will talk about in a bit more detail. And essentially this will really put Brisbane on the map and will be the pathway by which Brisbane will be able to get a whole lot of essential infrastructure that we are likely to need anyway. But the Olympic Games is really being pegged as the pathway by which we'll get some of this key infrastructure. And there's a whole lot of other social benefits that the government have been talking about. They've said that the Games will deliver about $8 billion worth of income benefit to the community, but about $3 billion of that is civic pride and sort of intangible things that the community will gain from hosting an Olympic Games. The government have been saying that this will really boost sports engagement, which the evidence is a bit patchy on. And so this is how we've sort of had it delivered to us so far. And I think having a bit of a critical eye to some of this will be important, and I'll talk about some of this next. So in my neighbourhood of South Brisbane, which will be really the epicentre of a lot of what's going on with the Olympic Games, we'll have, as I mentioned, the redeveloped Gabba Stadium just down the road from there. They're planning on turning one of our only bit of major parkland into a warm-up track. So there's a requirement that near the athletics track, there'll be a warm-up track where the athletes will be able to go and warm up and then head in a little shuttle bus down for their races. And right next door to the Gabba Stadium, many people don't know this, but there's a very small primary school. It shares the block with the Gabba Stadium, and at the moment, the edge of the stadium literally shadows over the school, and the kids have their playground and their basketball court literally under the shadow of the seating for the stadium. So we've got some big question marks about the impact that this will have immediately on a state school. We haven't been able to get many answers from the state government about what their plans are for the school, if they're going to relocate the school, if the school will be redeveloped. The government have kind of given some indication of what their plans are. But I think one of the important things to note is that there hasn't been any consultation on any part of the Olympic Games to date. We were never asked whether we wanted to host the Olympic Games. The school community has never been asked. The Wollongabba community has never been asked if they want to give up their park for this. A lot of other cities, when they've tried to make the decision about whether to put in a bid for the Olympic Games, have done like community plebiscites, and a lot of those come back with a no vote for a range of reasons. And we have never been asked. We've never gotten the opportunity to say, you know, is this something that we'd like, or to have our voice heard in how decisions will be made going forward. And the government have said, don't worry. Consultation is coming. You'll get your chance to have your say. But as I mentioned, like 10 years seems like a long time frame, but it's actually a lot shorter than you think. The plan to demolish the Gabba Stadium will start in 2025. That's only a few years away. And so our timeframes become very short when we're thinking about making sure inputting into good planning, good design, and thinking about planning that is long-term, that isn't just focused on the 2-week Olympic Games, that is focused on the long-term needs of the community to make sure that it's genuinely sustainable. And will meet the needs of the community for decades to come after that. There's been a lot of talk about legacy, and I know the state government is setting up a legacy committee, but I think one of the things to note is any genuine legacy that we will get from this will be the things that the community fights for. We can't just expect to be delivered long-term legacy or to be delivered great environmental outcomes. All of that will be things that we will have to fight for, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what forms resistance might take. One of our other big concerns is around housing costs. What we've been looking at a lot of the evidence from other Olympic Games. The impact that this has on housing is quite extreme. Nearly every Olympic city will see a very sharp increase in house prices, particularly in the neighbourhoods around the Athletes Village and around the main stadium. We've seen really big increases in house prices in Sydney, for example, in London, nearly anywhere where the Olympic Games have been hosted. And this is partly because this is a big drive for new development to come into the neighbourhood. And we're already seeing a lot of development applications come in for property developers who are saying that this is an opportunity to capitalise on the Olympic Games and are looking to design buildings for short-term accommodation to really be able to capture the Olympic Games rather than, designing long-term affordable accommodation for local residents. It's really just geared on how can we make a bit of money out of the Olympic Games. And then the other concern we've had is that we know that these major events are often associated with a very rapid gentrification that forces people out of the neighbourhood. There's really terrible stories about what happened in Rio and in Beijing for their Olympics. That's very extreme examples of people being physically cleared out of neighbourhoods. We're seeing similar things go on in LA. They're gearing up for their 2028 Olympic Games. And there's stories of very rapid gentrification, people being priced out of the neighbourhood and pushed out. And we're really concerned about what this might mean for affordability and community cohesion in this neighbourhood and in other neighbourhoods where there's going to be some of the Olympics venues. And so we've been calling on the government to have a strategy for housing affordability in these neighbourhoods, things like rent caps, rate caps, and guaranteeing that there will be affordable and social and public housing in new developments that are coming in. There were stories from the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games, for example, about people who were sleeping rough just being given bus tickets and told to just go over the border for a couple of weeks and then come back when the games were finished, and not really a strategy for giving those people homes long term. So sort of having an eye on the way in which the games will be affecting this neighbourhood. So as I mentioned, there's been no consultation on the Olympics to date. And so Jonathan and I have been doing quite a bit of community engagement over the last 18 months to make sure we've got a really good sense of what people's needs are, what people think about the Olympic Games. And we've been trying to put together a bit of a community vision that we can collectively come around to be pushing for the kinds of things that this community really needs. And one of the things I've been saying is, if this neighbourhood and in this city is going to shoulder the burden of this major international event, what are we getting in return to make sure that our neighbourhood remains strong and we're getting excellent public infrastructure that we can rely on? So we did a fairly extensive community survey to get feedback from people about what they felt about the Games and the kinds of things they'd like to push for. We found generally people were sceptical or opposed to the Olympic Games. It's kind of a bit mixed. About 53% of people were quite opposed to the Games, versus about 36% of people who were very happy about it, and then a bit of a grey area in between. People were particularly concerned about the cost of the Olympic Games. The government have said that this won't cost taxpayers any money, that they're paying for it from a combination of revenue from tickets and money that's coming in from the International Olympics Committee. But one of the things we know is that Olympic Games budgets blow out on average by 172%. And so it's nearly certain that that taxpayers will end up paying a fair chunk of the money for this. And a lot of people saying, couldn't that money go towards the housing crisis or the healthcare crisis or other things? And particularly for the Gabba Stadium that will be redeveloped at a cost of $1 billion when we're in the midst of a housing crisis. What could we be investing in that gets genuine long-term benefits for the community? We've been doing quite a bit of work with the community about Raymond Park as well. As I mentioned, this is the park that will be transformed for a warm-up track. It's one of the few bits of parkland in the neighbourhood. It hosts a 100-year-old soccer club, has 100-year-old trees, and is surrounded by houses that will very likely be resumed if they decide to put a warm-up track there. We've been looking at the dimensions of a warm-up track. It simply won't fit in the park as it is. And so some question marks around this as well. The community have never said that they wanted a warm-up track or that they would be happy to exchange their one park for a warm-up track. So we've been doing quite a lot of work with the community down there, and quite a bit of work with East Brisbane State School as well. And in terms of the broader community vision that we've put together, some of the key things people have asked for, and I'm just going to read off this vision that we've put together, are things like making sure there's full consultation, making sure there's genuine engagement with First Nations communities and elders, making sure there's a guarantee for local jobs, that there's people from the community who are being able to benefit from the kind of economic drive that the Olympics will bring. Heritage protection, making sure that heritage areas are protected, heritage buildings, delivery of public and active transport for the neighbourhood, and development that meets community needs. I'll pop a link to the community vision in the chat after I've finished if you want to have a look. This is kind of a work in progress, where we're still gathering data from the community about the kinds of things that we can be pushing so we can get a genuine positive outcome from this. I've seen a few people in the chat saying other cities have gotten these really great outcomes. I think there is capacity for us to get some great outcomes from the Olympic Games, but the important thing is making sure that the community voice is embedded in there so that whatever's delivered is actually responding to community need. And finally, I just wanted to flag some of the kinds of movements that are going on in other cities that are looking to host their Olympic Games. There's quite a strong movement that's developing in LA about making sure that their games are environmentally friendly and aren't displacing people. The area around their main stadium is seeing very, very rapid gentrification and encampments that have been cleared out of people who are sleeping in tents, and affordability just diminishing very quickly. So making sure that they're fighting for that affordable housing. There was a lot of protests around the Tokyo Olympic Games, with people really concerned about how it was affecting local people, and similarly around the lack of consultation. And also just taking some inspiration from the work that First Nations activists were doing around the Commonwealth Games. Some of you might have seen some of the Stolen Wealth Games protests that went on. And it was a really powerful reminder of whose land we're on, and who should be getting the benefits and making decisions about major events like this. So I might leave it there, and really happy to answer any of your questions, and hear any suggestions as well, in the lead up to the Games.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was an excellent overview. We've got some terrific questions coming in. Thanks, everybody. And we will hang on to them to the end so that we can pose a question and get everybody's input. I think it must be late and I must need a coffee. But thank you so much, Amy. And thank you for persevering with your technological issues. That was all very, very good. We'll be back and ask you a few more questions in a moment. Thanks so much. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Shri, who I'm sure many people know due to his huge level of activity and support of his community. So over to you, Jono.
Thanks, Michelle. Hey, everyone. So nice to be sharing this discussion with you. I see a lot of familiar faces and names in the chat. So yeah, I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation. I also want to acknowledge the rightful owners of this land, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'm coming at you from Woolloongabba, and want to acknowledge elders past and present and recognise that the struggle for Aboriginal sovereignty and self-determination needs to be really at the heart of these conversations we're having about the future of our region and the future of our city. Amy's covered off on a lot of really important issues that she and I have been working on together. I'm going to focus a little bit on transport and conversations about how we connect up our region, as well as waste and resource consumption and material use, and then also talk a bit about the opportunities in terms of restoration and enhancement of green spaces. So as a lot of people would be aware, usually genuinely one of the big benefits that comes out of hosting an Olympics is the improvements to transport infrastructure. Even the cities that have done a really poor job of hosting and they've wasted a lot of money and stuff, they usually leverage the Olympics as a way to get some big improvements to buses and trains and all that sort of stuff. The challenge, though, that we often grapple with is what are we actually designing our transport systems for? So this is, I'm sharing my screen, hopefully you can see this. It's not, the details aren't too important, but this is kind of the existing passenger train network for South East Queensland, which will be familiar to many of you. And what's immediately obvious is that everything goes in and out of the city. So the same is true for the bus routes and even the way flight patterns are in terms of connecting Brisbane to other parts of the state. So basically, we've designed a transport system that's all about getting people in and out of the middle of the city, the hub of consumerism and capitalism. And with the Games, that shifts slightly, but not too much. It basically becomes about moving people in and out of stadium hubs. So this next image I'll show you is a new bus route called the Gold City Glider route. So this is a proposed bus route, which the council's delivered a business case for it. They're trying to convince the state government to fund it, connecting from Woolloongabba Stadium. I'm hoping people can see my arrow, but down at the bottom of the image, from Woolloongabba Stadium up to Hamilton, where the athletes' village is. So there's a problem with this kind of planning in that it's still really about getting people between the big stadium for the Olympics and the athletes' village, and then via the city. So it's reinforcing the same connections. Like, we already have lots of buses and options to get from Woolloongabba into the city, for example. We don't really need another route to duplicate that. But what we tend to find with mega events, and particularly the Olympics, is that transport planning prioritizes the Games itself and doesn't think about what our region actually needs long term. So really what we need in South East Queensland is better connections between satellite cities so that, you could get public transport from Ipswich to Logan without having to go via Brisbane, and better public transport connections to coastal regions, et cetera, but also within Brisbane, better inter-suburban connections so that you can get from the suburbs north to the west without going in via the centre and back out again. Because we have such a centralised public transport system, so many people are still driving for those inter-suburban and inter-hub trips. And that's really what we need to be fighting for and pushing for. And that's really important if the broader goal is to decentralise our region and localise stuff. So rather than everyone travelling long distances to get to work or travelling into the inner city, we want to have more work and meaningful opportunities for people in their own communities, whether that's in suburban Brisbane or whether that's in the Sunshine Coast hinterland or wherever. It's about decentralising transport, and in so doing, decentralising so many of our other systems. And that's really one of the big concerns that we need to be pushing for, is when new transport routes like that Gold City glider I showed you, when new transport routes are being proposed or new projects are being announced in anticipation of the games, the question to be asking is, well, that might be great for getting people to and from the stadium, but how does it get people around outside of the context of the Olympics? Does that make sense? Yeah. So I'll leave that thought there for a moment. I'm mindful of time. I wanted to come back to the conversation about resource use. And Amy pointed out that while some venues are being reused, a lot of venues across for the games are essentially new build venues. And there's been some slippery language from the state government and the council on this front, because they sort of told us initially, oh, we'll be reusing 90% of venues. It'll be mostly reused venues. Don't worry, we're not doing anything wasteful. But the 10% of venues that they are building new are mostly the biggest venues. So, they're reusing some small stuff here and there, but a lot of the big stuff is new build. And if you have a look at so here's the Gabba Stadium, right? Just for context, just to the north, this is the park Amy was talking about, where they want to put the Olympics warm-up track. And these are those big 100-year-old fig trees that will probably all be removed. There's so many big mature trees around the edge of that park, and probably all these homes will be removed as well, to make room for the warm-up track, which will go here in Raymond Park. And then athletes will be shuttled up and down Duke Street to the Gabba. But let's think about the Gabba for a moment. This is a stadium that only about 15 years ago, they spent about $150 million upgrading and restoring this thing and modernizing it, et cetera. This is a huge piece of infrastructure, and the embodied energy, the embodied resources in terms of concrete and steel and all the materials and energy that's gone into building that is huge. It's phenomenal. And we know that, say, in terms of carbon emissions and climate change, cement production is one of the biggest sources of carbon emissions. So there's a huge environmental footprint involved in creating a stadium like this. And what the state government wants to do is demolish this. They want to level it to the ground, completely, like right down to the foundations, and then build an entirely new stadium on the same site that's slightly bigger in terms of footprint. It's not so much about the number of seats, but they need to have a slightly bigger field area to accommodate the athletics track. This is the primary school Amy mentioned that could well be displaced by the Olympics. So when we're thinking about the Olympics, we've got to think about kind of the symbols and stories that the Olympics tells or teaches the city. And I think to have our major venue be coming at the expense of an existing stadium, where we're literally demolishing an existing perfectly good stadium that's not that old, demolishing that to build an entirely new stadium that's just a slightly different design, is madness. And we need to describe it as such, and we need to push back really strongly and get that message out there that demolishing a stadium just to build another slightly different style of stadium is a ridiculous waste of resources. So when they're talking about the Olympics being a green or carbon neutral Olympics, it really is unfortunately greenwashing. When they talk about what emissions they're going to calculate and include in that sort of carbon neutral calculation, they're not talking about venue construction, because they describe venue construction as something that the host city is doing anyway. So They don't have to count all the emissions and all the embodied energy that goes into building a new stadium or the new swimming complex or whatever. All that's pushed to the side and is not considered when they talk about this carbon neutral Olympics. But more broadly than that, I think the Olympics is an opportunity to rethink not just how we can reuse and sustainably use materials for construction, but also how we manage waste. And it's interesting to think about the fact that Brisbane, and in fact, the whole South East Queensland region, is actually population-wise one of the smallest locations to host an Olympics in the modern era. So if you think back to recent host cities, go back to London and Beijing and China, Sydney, or like you can go right back. As a proportion of the global population, Brisbane's population is like the smallest city to host the Olympics in a long, long time. So that means that the influx of so many people for a mega event like the Olympics is going to have a proportionally larger impact on the city. It's going to be, you know, for a city like Tokyo or even Rio de Janeiro, those mega cities, they can absorb a few 100,000 extra tourists or visitors relatively easily. And even those cities still have a lot of displacement of poorer residents. But for a city like Brisbane, that volume of people coming in is going to have a really big impact on the city's infrastructure and facilities and capacity to cope. I think one figure I heard was that just in terms of journalists and media alone, there's about 50,000 people will usually come to the games. That's just the journalists. So by 2032, we're probably looking at close to 20,000 athletes, and then all their support staff and all that, and then all the visitors as well. So we're talking huge numbers of people that not only do they have to be housed, but they have to be fed, their waste has to be managed. And that creates both a challenge and an opportunity to think about how we do that sustainably. How can we develop systems during the Olympic Games to cater for that massive influx of people that can then be pivoted towards sustainable reuse of waste and on an ongoing basis. So we don't have time to go into all the ins and outs of it now, but I think it's a really important question to be posing and thinking about. It shouldn't just be a carbon neutral games in that sort of really simplistic sense, but it should be a resource neutral games where nothing ends up in landfill. That should be the starting motto. Nothing ends up in landfill, nothing is lost, nothing is wasted. And that's, I think, there's one question that popped up, which I'm sure we'll come to later, but I was going to touch on this anyway. When we're thinking about venues and how the Olympics will be structured, we're often told that, the decisions are already locked in. For example, the state government is saying, well, hosting at the Gabba was part of our bid, therefore we have to do it. That's not strictly true. What tends to happen is that between a host city being announced and actually hosting the games, a lot of changes happen in terms of venue locations and where the athletes' village will be and where this will be and where that will be. Interestingly, Paris has just announced that they won't be holding their opening and closing ceremonies in a stadium. They're actually going to hold their opening and closing ceremonies along the river. And it's not clear exactly what that looks like yet, but I think that's a really interesting kind of example of how to democratize the event so that more people can access it. It's not just the people who can buy a ticket to get in the stadium, but also a way to not have to design a giant stadium purely to hold all those people. And I think that's something we should be talking about with the Gabba, because we do have other, we've got other facilities. We've got, as I think a few people in the comments mentioned, there's the QE2 stadium, which was built for the Commonwealth Games. It's a lot more appropriate in many respects. I'm just trying to find it. Sorry, it's down here. Can people give me a thumbs up if you can see that still? Yeah, that's cool. So this is the QE2 stadium. You'll see that they already have their warm-up track right next door, so you wouldn't have to knock down 100-year-old fig trees to create a warm-up track. And then we also have the Carrara Stadium that was built at the Gold Coast. I won't take you all the way down there, but we've got new stadiums that were built for the Commonwealth Games. So it is foreseeable, for example, that you could hold some of the athletics events in the Gabba Stadium, and you could even have sort of your 100-meter track and field events. But maybe you don't need to have the full 400-meter athletics track at the Gabba Stadium, and maybe you don't have to use it for the opening and closing ceremonies, which means that maybe we don't have to demolish the whole thing and rebuild it. So I don't think those decisions are locked in at all, and I think it's a good time to be talking about what else we can be doing. I've just got a couple of minutes left, so I did want to touch on the opportunity for a greener Brisbane. And obviously, I'm sure most of us are really passionate about that. But that's one of the things that sets Brisbane apart and is really one of the special features that we offer as a tourism attraction, is not just our proximity to green destinations in the hinterland, like the forests and the beaches and all that sort of stuff, but the sheer abundance of wildlife and intact ecological corridors within the city is pretty impressive. And with a little bit of sensible investment now, we could reconnect and enhance a lot of existing wildlife corridors, and make that one of the centerpieces of the Brisbane Olympic experience. So you come into the city maybe to see some athletes, but you're also coming to see the brush-tailed possums that are running along the power lines. And that itself might seem mundane to us, but is a special thing for a lot of people. I think flowing on from that though, is the way that the sites and facilities are reutilized. So Amy and I have been really excited that over in South Brisbane, the government has agreed to buy the big old glass factory that she mentioned. It's this large industrial site here, and they're going to use that as a media center. And after the media center, the state government will try to sell as much of that land off to developers as they can. And the community will have to fight for as much of that site to be preserved as green space and public parkland as possible. We kind of succeeded halfway with South Bank, where some of South Bank, after Expo 88, some of it was sold off to developers, but a lot of it was preserved as parkland. And that'll be the challenge and the tension with that glass factory site down in West End. I'm pretty much out of time now, but I just sort of wanted to finish with the idea that the Olympics normally is basically an orgy of mass consumption, of mass exploitation of low-income workers and of athletes, so that a few big event companies and media companies can make a lot of money. That's the dominant paradigm, but we've got 10 years to turn that around. We've got an opportunity to create a very different kind of an Olympics, a green Olympics, a people's Olympics that can deliver a positive legacy for the city and the region, but also be a really positive example for the rest of the world. So I don't want to be hosting the Olympics. I wish we weren't. If it wasn't too expensive, I think we should be backing out while we still can. But if we are stuck with this thing, let's make the best of it and see what we can achieve. Thanks for listening and looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. That was great, Jono. And you were not over time. You were spot on, which is terrific. I'm just finishing with my own little fiddling with my buttons here. So I'll remove that and remove that. Very good. Thank you so much, Jono. And now we'll turn to Elise. And look, we've been watching the questions and Kira's been collating them and they're excellent. We're going to have a really good discussion, some great suggestions in there too. So now I'd like to introduce Elise Perups from the Queensland Social Enterprise Council. And Elise, if you could commence the commencements, I'm going to keep fiddling with the buttons to make sure that you are pinned.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm coming to you from Quandam, Mooka country, down in the south east of the city of Brisbane, where there will be a whitewater rafting facility built not too far from my house. So this is very close to my heart. I also want to just take a moment to also respect that I'm walking on unceded lands here. And in social enterprise, we're the head of social enterprise in Queensland. We often refer to First Nations principles when we talk about social enterprise and acknowledge that First Nations cultures across the globe, and particularly here in Australia, they do it best. And we've learnt so much from the way that Indigenous business works, the way that they present themselves is a source of great wisdom to us. So we're paying respects not just to the land that we work on, but the traditional ways of partnering and collaborating and sharing resources. And so much good stuff was spoken about in detail with Amy and Jono's stories there. But I want to take you one step up. I'm going to ask you to move from the detail to the macro. So the reason why QSEC is involved in this whole thing is because some of our members had seen, and I think Mark's on the call tonight, had seen a presentation from Gina Reinhardt, who's one of the lead sponsors from this for the Games. And her focus was really very much on making sure that super yachts were going to be accommodated well when they arrive at the Games. So we knew we had to start having a much deeper conversation than what the sponsors wanted, what the games needed. How do we actually build a vision for a city of what we want to achieve? And even if we weren't to go ahead with the games, I think this is relevant. I think we need to start with a conversation around the principles of how we want to work together. How do we actually build a vision for a city and an area, a South East Queensland area that will accommodate the games potentially, most definitely. But how do we make sure that we actually stay true to a vision of reciprocity and regeneration? So when we talk about regenerative communities in social enterprise world, we actually talk about the 5 R's. I'm going to just briefly kind of go into this for a bit. So we talk about respect, number 1. We talk about reciprocity, so the gift of actually giving to each other equally. Right action, how do we do it with ethics in our heart? How do we look at it through redistribution of resources, of wealth, of common needs and common wealth? And how do we talk about it through a sense of renewal, which is actually a really important sense and goes beyond just sustainability. All of these things in terms of regeneration move us beyond just business as usual. It moves us beyond just sustainability. We actually have to start looking at things very, very differently. So QSEC's involvement here is leading up to the Social Enterprise Forum, which happens in Brisbane for the first time in September 28th and 29th. So together with Regen Brisbane, we decided to embark upon a starting point for this conversation. Now, I know that Green Prince and Regen movements across the globe have actually a much deeper conversation than what we're going to embark upon with Regen right now. But what we wanted to try and do was to map out a quadruple bottom line approach from the get-go. So with QSEC, we often talk about culture being the first principle of quadruple bottom line. And what does culture mean? Well, it's actually around those regenerative principles that I just spoke about then. So through respect, reciprocity, right action, redistribution and renewal, we actually bring together a sense of cultural divinity, if you like, using the First Nations principles. So we start with culture, then we move to society. How do we want to build a vision for a just and equitable society? How do we actually look at that, with the actions that we want to take, the themes that we want to try and imbue? And we've mentioned some of these today. So housing, mental health, all of those wonderful things that make our society just, homelessness, all of those things. Then we often talk about the environment and ourselves and people within the environment. And that's a very critical one. And Regen is actually going to be leading on that conversation for us. And then we'll sum it all up for economics going last, not first, you'll notice. So from all of those 3 principles, we then look at economies of scale that can actually serve all of the other pillars of strength and vision throughout this whole adventure that we're embarking on. So it's really very, very important to us from QSEC's perspective that social enterprise is included in this conversation, that we walk with Regen Brisbane the whole way through this next adventure. And this is not just these next 4 fabulous face-to-face and online sessions that we're running in collaboration. We're going to be taking what we found through those 4 pillars to the Social Enterprise World Forum. We're going to be showing that with a graphic recorder who'll be then designing up some images and some imagery around that vision, the higher level vision of what we want to have achieved by the end of this process. Then Regen Brisbane is going to take us on an amazing journey over the next year or so to really deepen the conversation, to build a city profile around some of those tenets that we've just discussed and the themes that emerge out of these next 4 face-to-face sessions. And I'm so excited that we're going to be able to then produce an action plan that doesn't just rely on government. It's not just about how can the government do something for us. We have to involve communities. We have to involve businesses. We have to involve corporates. We're going to be talking a lot with the government in coming weeks and months around social procurement, particularly. If they're going to be purchasing all of these things, then how do we make sure that social procurement is included in every step of the way? We're going to be talking to them a lot about circular economies and about how we actually design in the solutions before we even start. So when we talk about what are we going to be doing with waste materials, how do we design that in to every single conversation, and how do we put some throughputs? I saw that Yasmin Grigolunius is here from World's Biggest Garage Sale. She's a brilliant champion in our space for circular economies, and I'd really love to include Yasmin in this conversation as well. Byron's put a link up. So Byron's working with Wax Enterprises, who's bringing Social Enterprise World Forum to Brisbane as well, and we're super excited to be able to share a lot of this vision with the participants at the Social Enterprise World Forum as well. So the levers for change that we're really looking for through this action, this right action of actually including community voice to this table, is that we would love to have this action plan presented to government so that philanthropists and community groups and all of those things can get involved. We're looking for support for social procurement. We want social enterprises to be included and community groups and community service organisations to be included in the plan forward, so that we're actually ensuring that at every step of the way that human-centred design is at the centre of what we're actually intending to do. Just to close off, I wanted to show you two things. I'm going to show, first of all, I'm going to show you just the overall picture of what these first 4 sessions will look like. And then please make sure that you stick with us, because the Regen Brisbane is going to take us on a fabulous, deeper journey. But I'm just going to share this screen first up, so you can plot and plan to either join us online for these first 4 sessions, or face-to-face at the Brisbane Business Hub, where we'll be hosting these 4 conversations with some brilliant, absolutely brilliant speakers, plenary speakers. So we'll have some provocation to begin with. We'll share some food with some very key questions that we'll be asking through that break time, and then a workshop to really try and disseminate all of the ideas. The wonderful Michelle Maloney is going to be online hosting a fabulous forum event, so that your voices can be heard, so that you can help co-design what we might be able to present to government. So make sure you jot these 4 sessions down in your diaries now. There's a handy dandy little QR code, because you all know how to do QR codes now. So you can jump on there and book your tickets either online or in person for those 4 events, which is fantastic. And I think, Kira, could you share the link to the Humanitics page as well? That would be terrific. And then the other thing, just to whet your appetite about the Social Enterprise World Forum, I'd love to be able to share with you just a very short video, if I might, before I close off, before we go to some questions, because I know you've got some brilliant questions in there. I'm just going to see if I can make my Fandango work, because, we do love a little bit of tech challenge, don't we? Let me see if I can actually help play this for you.
Jingari. Jingari. That's hello in our Yugambeh language.
In times of global change and global crisis, what really matters is the work in the communities. And that's why I think social enterprises matter even more than before now.
The Social Enterprise World Forum actually creates the connections that you couldn't find any other way, and gives you the opportunity to have a face-to-face or a digital conversation with those people and really advance your thinking and find those collaborators that you can share with right across the world.
Australia has the oldest continuous living culture in the world. We have a history of engagement and trade and business, and that's something that we're really excited to share with the rest of the world.
I think social enterprises are going to change the world, and I'm excited to see how people are being quite innovative and creative with their businesses.
I just can't wait to see so many friends and peers in Brisbane.
So I really hope I see some of you at the Social Enterprise World Forum, but I really want to see you face to face at the Brisbane Hub on each of those 4 dates. And I'm just so delighted that Regen Brisbane and QSEC can be working together to form such a strong partnership.
Thank you so much, Elise. That was lovely. And the Social Enterprise World Forum is already attracting a whole bunch of folks inside our other networks, the New Economy Network, and some of the regen movements are putting in proposals to get involved. So I think it'll actually be a really lovely gathering of good folks. Now I'm just going to add the pin. I'm doing my buttons. Actually, Amy, I'm just going to pin you too, my dear. All right. I will, I suppose I'll pin myself. There we go. Lovely. I won't stay pinned, but what I wanted to do was just thank all 3 of our speakers. It's been a really, really important overview for some of us, not being aware of all of the different venues and such. In a moment, I'll ask Kira to start kind of sharing some of the questions. We might squish a few of them together here and there if there are similar themes, but I'm going to take the chairperson's right of first question. I would actually like to know, and I'm not sure if Amy and Jono might be the ones to answer this, but at the end of the day, who are making the decisions about all of this stuff? We've heard that there's an Olympic committee. The wonderful Kira invited many of those folks to try to engage them, to come and talk. Nobody wants to talk to us. So can you tell us a little bit about who are the decision makers, and where can we continue to try to push and influence the decisions that are being made? Where can we get the information?
Yeah, I might kick off and Jono can probably fill in some of the gaps. So there's a few different moving parts in terms of governance and decision making. There's the Olympics committee that you've mentioned that has quite a lot of members. It's chaired by Andrew Liveris, who has been the chair of the Dow Company. There's a bunch of ex-Olympians and federal, state and council representatives on there as well. But I think one of the probably more important committees will be an infrastructure coordination committee that hasn't been set up yet. So this will be a partnership between the state and federal government. And they'll be directing a lot of the big infrastructure, particularly anything that is joint funded by the state and federal government. But the state government will be driving a lot of this, and a lot of the venues that are being developed or redeveloped are either some like in state hands already, like the GABA, like some of the other sports facilities, or are included within priority development areas, which some of you may be familiar with. They're a big planning tool that the state government uses that isn't particularly transparent or driven by community engagement. And so the Roma Street Brisbane Live, or the Brisbane Arena, for example, is within a priority development area. So I think some of the key levers will still be at the state level, and putting pressure on state ministers, particularly the planning minister, who's in charge of a lot of the infrastructure and decisions about how that works. I'd say some of this will fall down to councils as well. Elise mentioned the whitewater rafting track out at the Redlands. The Redlands City Council are very involved in this, and from what I understand, are pushing to evoke some heritage areas in order to get that whitewater rafting area going. And it'll be similar in other areas where the city councils are very involved. So there's quite a few moving parts. I have also been trying to get meetings with the Olympics committee. I've met with one of the committee members so far, and trying to reach out to others and make sure that some of our key concerns are on the table. Anything you want to add there, Jono?
I mean, yeah, just briefly, as Amy mentioned, really the Olympics committee holds a lot of power, and they're it's subservient to the International Olympics Committee. And we saw that, say, with the Tokyo Games, where Tokyo got to the point during COVID where they're like, look, we don't even want to host the games anymore. Can we just cancel it or skip it or do a scaled down version? And the IOC was like, no, too bad, Japan, you have to do this. You've signed the contract. If you back out now, you're on the hook for billions of dollars. And so really the IOC ends up calling the shots. And I think we saw a kind of a brief glimpse of that. I don't know if you remember when the announcements first happened and Palaszczuk was over, I think in Tokyo, and John Coates from the Olympics committee was like calling the shots and telling her what to do and chastising it. Like that really revealed where the hidden power structures are sitting. But even behind the IOC, it's sort of like we've got our decision makers on paper who are supposedly the democratic politicians and decision makers. Then we've got the IOC sitting above them. But the other entity that really pulls a lot of the International Olympics Committee strings is the NBC, which is the big broadcasting media company from the US. I'll post this. There's a link to the Wikipedia page in the chat. You don't have to look at it in detail, but their broadcasting contract with is worth billions of dollars, and they're essentially one of the main entities directing funding into the IOC. So the IOC's money that it then gives to Brisbane and to the Australian Olympics Committee to host the games, most of that money that the IOC is getting is coming from NBC. So if the NBC, the big US media company, isn't happy about something, then that's a problem for everyone down the line. So even if Brisbane is saying, oh, we don't want to do an opening ceremony in a stadium, we want to host it along the river, the NBC is going to be the ultimate decision maker in that, because they're the ones going to say, well, is this good or bad for our broadcasting rights and our viewers? So at the end of the day, actually, it's those TV broadcasting and internet broadcasting companies that hold a lot of shadow power. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And of course, we could have a much broader conversation about these decision-making and governance structures, but we might hold them off for another day. So, Kira, would you like to perhaps read out some of the questions? We may not have time for all of them. We've got 23 minutes. Perhaps, Kira, you could start from the first questions and we'll work our way through as quickly as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Andy asked, will all the building materials be recycled? Will they be using green concrete and green steel? Will the buildings be renewably powered?
No, and maybe. They will probably be renewable energy powered. That's the kind of easiest bit for governments to do. But unless there's a really strong push from the community and from like civil society, there will not be renewable or green materials used. They'll just push that to the side and try not to think about it too much. It's a shame.
Follow-up question, would it be the infrastructure committee that is about to be formed that would be the group that may be able to make some of those structural decisions in terms of how things get used, resourced, recycled?
Yeah, I think that'll be part of it, but it'll also be about the procurement policy at the state government level that Elise has alluded to, making sure that that is not only in place but is followed, which is the other part of the challenge. The government have said that this Olympics will be carbon positive, which from what we understand means that the event as a whole should draw down more carbon. We don't have any details about that or any details about how that will be reported and how the government will be accountable to that. But that's something on the public record that people could be using as a bit of a lever to be saying, look, you really need to be looking at your building materials, looking at what sort of companies you're engaging with, making sure that there's a kind of ethical process from start to finish.
I think one of the first and biggest demands is to say the buildings and the infrastructure has to be counted in that carbon positive calculation, because right now it's not.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Kira. Back to you.
Okay, so the next question is from Mark. Will the Brisbane River itself be potentially used for any of the Olympic events?
I think it could. That'd be great. I don't think it's going to be at the moment, but theoretically, some of the sailing events, heck, I'd like to see the Brisbane River one day be clean enough to swim in. I think that's a realistic target that we should aspire towards. It's entirely doable if we stop more sediment getting into the river. So yeah, let's make the river clean enough to swim in and then make it an Olympic space.
Yeah, from what we know so far for the water events, The rowing will be out at Lake Wyaralong, and the whitewater rafting will be at the Redlands, and it says here sailing at the Royal Queensland Yacht Squadron. I'm not sure if that is a location or an organisation, but yeah, as far as we know, the river itself won't be involved for actual sports, but might be involved with other events that'll be going on during the games.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Yasmin, and I kind of put both the questions from Yasmin and Fiona together. So what can we do well in advance to ensure procurement policies support the following: social enterprise, circular economy, Indigenous enterprises, regional and Queensland owned and operated enterprises, and with specific requirements to meet diverse and deliberate direction for economy and community benefit? Is that something, Elise?
You're on mute, Elise.
Yes, to all of the above. So in the conversations we've had to date with government, they have indicated that Indigenous business, social procurement, local business clearly is all going to be included in the purchasing power. Just to what level is a little bit of a question for us at the moment, and also building the capability in the 10-year window that we have. We've got a 10-year runway now, I think, as Amy quite put to us quite well before. We have a runway to prepare ourselves for what we want to see. So if we want to see more Indigenous businesses, more capable social enterprises, circular economies included into the design of the games, we actually need to put that lever in there right now. We can't wait for 10 years. We actually have to, if, you know, for instance, just Muriel from Full Circle Fibres keeps reminding me, if we want to have towels made in Australia and not have a huge merchandising drama that has to come from, you know, from different shores, then how do we build the capability within Australia, within Queensland, to make sure that we're selecting fibres which are either recycled or ethically sourced? How do we get the plant, equipment and materials and skilled labour ready for those sorts of things? How do we make sure that each part of that mechanism is going to be supported in our supply chains? So we have already a huge supply chain disruption in the last couple of years from COVID. We know that that's going to continue to be fraught. With economies changing and shifting across the globe, with reliance on fossil fuels still too high, we know that supply chains are going to be impacted. How do we reduce our footprint? How do we create better systems that will help improve what we want to see for the vision of the 2032 Games and beyond? Like, it's seriously, this is not a conversation where the end point should be the 2 weeks of the Olympic Games. This conversation needs to be giving us a shadow or a vision for what happens beyond 2032. If we're just end gaming to make sure that we've got a lovely games, then I think we're doing some bright, shiny marketing and branding rather than actually looking at systemic change and looking at the Sustainable Development Goals from a UN's perspective and changing the systems to make us all be better, to have business as usual go beyond business as usual.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also just wanted to pick up on what Wayne has mentioned in the comments, really leaning on both the state and federal government to be investing in local manufacturing, that we can be embedding really good labour standards in, really good environmental standards in. You mentioned things as simple as where we're sourcing fibres from. If we've got a local manufacturing industry that can be drawing on local industries, that not only we can embed, you know, a lot of these values in, but also helps insulate us from future shocks and disruptions to our supply chains. I think, you know, we've lost a lot of that in Australia and Queensland over the last few decades, but there's a lot of capacity to be picking up some of that, for the Games and beyond.
Great, thank you. And can I just give a little plug? The New Economy Network Australia, one of its kind of core threads is localisation. And we certainly saw through COVID those communities that had local sources of everything did a whole lot better. Kira, next question, Dale.
Yeah, so Fiona sort of just wanted to add on from that question from Yasmin. That she agrees with Jasmine, but would add not only long-term needs of the community, but also what about environment, nature, and wildlife? How are these being safeguarded in all the planning?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think to date, it's been pretty disappointing. Jono and I gave the example of Raymond Park, and that's just a small example, but these 100-year-old established trees that will potentially be knocked down for a warm-up track. And there's likely to be pretty big environmental impacts from some of the other new and redeveloped facilities that are going on around the neighbourhood and more broadly. And yeah, looking at the kind of environmental overlay down there. Elise, you might have some more details on the whitewater rafting area, for example, which from what I understand might be impacting koala habitat. So where we could be looking at, I mean, one of the key things for this Olympic Games is it's meant to be under the banner of a new norm, which is as little new infrastructure as possible, really recognising that a lot of Olympic Games end up with big white elephant infrastructure that doesn't get used afterwards. And so the idea is to really be using what we have, or having very deep planning to make sure that anything we build has a long-term future. But a lot of these facilities are just going to be temporary or are new.
Yeah.
And so we'll be having some impacts. But yeah, don't know if you've got any further insights from where you are.
Well, I think we're very lucky tonight to have Councillor Paul Bishop from Birkdale Thornsey, who happens to be my husband, disclaimer, in the call tonight. And Paul, I'm not sure if you're in a position to come off mute, because I know you're at a community function tonight. He's listening in with eager ears. I know that there has been some conjecture around community input into the game site, and also ecological studies that are yet to be done on the site itself. So, there are some concerns around making sure, so he says in the text message, you can text but not speak. If I stuff it up, Paul, you'll let me know, right? So I know that there's some planning that's still required, and whether that's the best site for the game, for that particular part of the games or not, has not yet been finally rubber stamped, but I do think it's almost a fait accompli. Yes, we need those studies, and not just from a natural perspective, but also from Quandamooka people. What's the studies that have been done from a historical perspective? So there's some big questions around that at the moment, untested.
Okay, the next question.
Sorry, I just wanted to see, Jono, did you want to respond to that issue?
I mean, there's lots I could say. I'm pretty damn cynical about this space.
I could see you kind of, controlling yourself there. So.
I will just add though that, like, if we were serious about sustainability, we wouldn't be having thousands of people flying from all over the world to Brisbane. And a more radical vision of a sustainable games would be to say, let's use digital technologies to bring the games to people via the internet, rather than all of those people having to travel to Brisbane. That's we don't even need all the athletes coming here. We can have different events in different parts of the world and spread that around, so people can travel to an Olympics event in their home city rather than everyone coming to Brisbane. The fossil fuel emissions alone from this games are going to be astronomical in terms of plane flights. And for me, that's one of the biggest environmental impacts above and beyond the local stuff like tree clearing, etc.
No, it's a very, very old economy model to fly 100,000 people all into one city. Yeah, thanks. Sorry to cut you off there, Kira. Next question.
No worries. Okay, so I think we touched on this a little bit, but Elaine asked, how would the Olympics impact people sleeping rough?
Really badly. We know this from heaps of previous events, from the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games, Sydney Olympics, the G20 that was held in Brisbane in 2014. It impacts people directly in the sense that from some areas, they will be forcibly moved on and told you can't stay here, you can't camp here. But it also impacts people less obviously in the way that public spaces are redesigned to encourage certain behaviours and discourage others. And South Bank is a really interesting example of this, where South Bank has been designed in a way that lots of people come there and love it, and it's really good for a lot of things. But if you're there past midnight, the police will be called on you and you'll be arrested if you refuse to move. That's how South Bank operates. So it's a great picnic spot for sort of families and everything. But if you're homeless trying to stay there after late at night, it's a very different story. And we see that with a lot of modern public spaces. The really obvious, like hostile architecture stuff, where like benches are designed so you can't sleep on them. And then the less obvious stuff, like really bright lighting that never goes off, so you can't sleep in the space comfortably, or spaces being designed so that there are places that are nice to sit and there are places that are quiet, but there aren't places that are nice to sit and quiet. So you can never find that, you know, calm, quiet space to stay in overnight. So yeah, it's going to be really bad for our sleepers, and we'll have to fight really hard to resist that tendency to displace and push out people, both the overt displacement of people where the cops are called in or the council is moving them on, and the much more subtle stuff in terms of how spaces are designed and regulated and managed.
Yeah, I might just also add one about, as I mentioned, our concerns around housing affordability and how the Games might be forcing people into homelessness. We know that there is there's a lot of community and social housing around Woolloongabba, and you know, will that be up for redevelopment over the next 10 years as land values increase, and where will those people go? Will they still be able to afford in the neighbourhood where they're close to community services and so on, or will they be forced out to outer suburbs or forced into homelessness? And so I think having a view to that broader social justice and things like housing will be really important. I think there are some opportunities here. You know, for example, looking at how the venues for the athletics accommodation and the Paralympics accommodation is designed in such a way that it can be turned into social housing afterwards. We haven't done a good job of this historically in making sure that those venues are designed for long-term accommodation. But that will be a key thing that Jono and I and others will be pushing for.
Can I just add in there, Tiziana, you've just put in the chats there, all of these points could be put into a white paper, and that's the intention. So when we capture all of these individual points, as we've just said, you know, through the homelessness aspect, transportation, circular economies, what does a just and regenerative economy look like? At each one of those junctures, that's what we're hoping to build is a bit of an action plan to use the levers and policy shifters to make some change. So that's the intention of these conversations.
That's great, fantastic. Sorry.
Yeah, and in a way, the 4 workshops that we're gonna, I'll remind you all of the dates, and Kira can pop the link in again, but the 4 workshops that Elise mentioned is like a little snapshot of some of the issues and some of the things that we want to talk about together as a community, which Elise will then be promoting to the social enterprise community and will be continuing into next year. So the idea of a white paper or an alternative plan, or, you know, a very rigorous analysis of what's being proposed with additional input from communities, from representatives. That's kind of one of the plans, but it's not just about the Olympics, but it will certainly be on the horizon because it is a catalyst for a whole bunch of other things. So,
can I say something? I saw Elaine Lamb, who's a UQ student, putting a point about students collaborating, and I don't want to promote my university, but being in a school of design, I think it's a really great idea to be able to do some you know, some projects, real world projects, and connect with students thinking about, as we also do in our normal curriculum. Elaine, that's a great idea. May
I second that, or third that as a great idea. And I already wrote in there, please connect your university students to Regen Brisbane. We would love to help connect them to other groups like QSEC and others who are doing research and tasks, and we can bring it all together. So Regen Brisbane's not trying to create an empire. We just want to connect all of the folks who are already doing great stuff. And perhaps your students could then connect with some very real internships and projects that help their research, but also help the work that we're all trying to do. Because gathering data, gathering and collating stories from other places, a whole bunch of other work, tons of work could be done to really make some amazing opportunities for input. So yes, please get in touch.
Absolutely, I'll do it tomorrow.
Huzzah!
Get in touch with you.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes left. Kira, I wonder if you could, if you scan the questions, if you could kind of clump a few together, like if there's a couple that look at one issue, or but we've certainly got time for 1 or 2 more questions with answers.
Yeah, okay. So I will, I'll just do 2 more. One's a really quick one from Wayne. He's saying Sleeman Centre is first class for swimming and it's been ignored, and are we to lose part of Roma Street parklands?
Yeah, both really great questions. This is something that Jono and I and others have been pushing, that there are other great venues around that haven't been considered. There's QE2 Stadium that already is a very big stadium, has a warm-up track. As Wayne's mentioned, there's lots of other venues that could be considered that already exist. And I think we will keep pushing for this because while some of this feels inevitable, there are decisions to be made now, particularly now that we have a new federal government, and they're going to be funding quite a bit of this and this collaborative infrastructure committee to be making decisions around that. And also with Roma Street parklands, it's a really great question. There's a broader priority development area over the parklands and the adjoining areas, including over the train tracks. There's a master plan out for that at the moment. There is a reduction in parkland that's going to happen. The Brisbane Arena isn't in the existing parklands, but there are sections of what is green space at the moment that are being redeveloped for housing. The government are able to get around this by saying that these areas were never considered within the core of Roma Street parklands, and so we're not actually losing the formal parklands, but we're losing parklands that's directly adjoining to the parklands there. It's going to be a huge development. There's no height limits on a lot of sections there. It's going to really transform that part of town.
Okay, thank you. And just a last one, which kind of has, I've put them all in together a little bit. Fiona asked, so if IOC and NBC are calling the shots, how do we navigate this to ensure this has the ecological and community vision we want for Brisbane? And how do we negotiate that?
I think there will be a need for creative forms of civil disobedience and direct action to rectify that power imbalance. We've got entities that aren't even based in Australia and are right up here calling the shots, and then multiple layers of abstraction between them and the people on the ground. So we might only be able to put direct pressure on our city council and our state government MPs and our federal MPs. And if we can apply enough pressure on those people, then hopefully they start pushing back at higher levels of government. It's going to be difficult though. This is a huge event and there's so much money behind it. We have to struggle. We have to find ways to resist and ways to push back and ways to work with the system where possible. And we're not going to be able to win everything we want, but I think it starts by being willing to fight for the stuff that's really important, and accepting that if we don't fight, we won't get anything. But yeah, I think, yeah.
I'd like to second the second part of what you said there, Jonathan, which is if we don't lay out a plan, then it's going to be civil disobedience, sure, but no one's actually knows what we want. And there'll be small factions fighting for their small bits. And I just don't think that that's going to be a resolved piece of work that can be relied on for change. And I think if we're looking at this project as beyond 2032, You know, how do we want to redesign our systems for best use? So I think, you know, if we don't start by actually using our voices, turning up to these sorts of meetings, talking to people in your street, in your town, your neighbours, your communities, your businesses, we need to actually have a unified voice around the systems change piece. How do we do that with a sense of urgency? Because we only have 10 years. I mean, it seems like a long way away, but as Amy said at the beginning, it's actually not. We have to have an action plan which is clear and direct. We have to have included as many voices at the table as we possibly can, so that we're not leaving out the quiet voices, so that we are actually compelling government to stand up and say, actually, this is fair, this is just, this is reasonable. We need to have some systems change. And there is a global push for this. It's not that we're doing this in isolation. I mean, if you have a look at the work of Regen Melbourne, Regen Sydney, and others around the globe, the Transition Towns movement, the way that social enterprise is rising up, Indigenous business strength goes, just keeps powering on. We actually have got the movement for change behind us. People are seeing the impacts of climate change. There is an evolution happening on our doorstep. How do we harness that power to best use to make sure that we've got the levers we need within government and also community action to back it up?
Thank you. And look, we might use that as a segue to quickly close the session. There's lots of other questions. Amy has very kindly put her own email address in the chat. I don't know if Amy, Jono, Elise, if you want to put your own contact details in there again. So if any folks had questions that didn't get answered tonight, but may I, while we wrap up, share with you a reminder about our fabulous workshops that Elise has already mentioned. All right, just quickly, 1 minute and we'll be finished. So as Elise has already said, we've got these first 4 workshops this year, and then there'll be an ongoing discussion after that, not to exhaust people, but to have these kind of chunks of time where we can come together. The dates are here: 8 July, 29th of July, 19th of August, 2nd of September. Each workshop looks at a slightly different angle: culture, society, environment, economy. We'll be combining some core issues that are important for us locally, but also including a donut economics framework, and also green prints, which is the scaffolding under which Regen Brisbane is looking at all of its work. And we could tell you all about more of these things if you connect with us. That would be lovely. And just as an extra exciting plug, in the workshop next week, Friday, Mary Graham will be joining us by Zoom. I'll be the Zoom DJ that day, and Elise and Kira will be in the room in the in-person gathering, so we can do it online, we'll do it all together, and we'll be collating and sharing all the output and info that comes along. So if anyone is interested who hasn't already connected with us, you can jump on our very brand new website, and a huge thank you again to James Lee for creating that beautiful, the images that we're now using. You can email us at info@regen-brisbane.net.au. You can find us on Facebook with the same name. And just a quick little plug, everything that Regen Brisbane is interested in can be portrayed this way, making sure that we create a beautiful living world for humans and non-humans, whilst also ensuring we live within our limits and have a very strong, happy, thriving economy and social activities, but all within the bioregional capacity of place. And that's why a lot of the discussions around wildlife corridors, green spaces, and all of that connectivity, particularly dear to the hearts of some of us. So on that note, I will start to wrap up. I might let Elise, Jono and Amy, if they've got any final things they want to say or places they want to point you to, please let folks know now, and then we'll close for the night. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Kira, for your co-hosting. You are awesome. But if you do want to take action to purchase from a social enterprise, make sure you check out our directory at www.qsec.org.au. There are so many different social enterprises that you could purchase from right now, today. Don't wait. Take action. make sure that you have a positive transaction with every single time you open your wallet. Get onto it. See you at the workshops.
Thank you, Elise. Amy and Jono, anything else?
I'm just posting contact details in the chat. If anyone wants to follow me or sign up to my email newsletter, you can stay in the loop about the work we're doing.
Wonderful.
Thanks again for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jono. Amy.
Yeah, just wanted to say thank you so much to Regen for having us and for starting this conversation. I think it's really important that we're starting now to be talking about the Olympics and making sure we've got a collective community vision for what we want to see, and using all the different avenues and levers that we have available to us to be pushing for that. It does seem like it can feel like a big monolith that is hard to get into, but I think if there's enough collective power that we're building on the ground and those connections, we have the capacity to get some genuine, really incredible legacies for our community. So yes, if anyone wants to get in touch, I've popped my email address in the chat as well. Would love to chat more.
Awesome. That is lovely. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention. Thank you for the wonderful questions. And please do connect with all of the good folks who've just shared their details and with Regen Brisbane. And I totally agree with Amy. No matter how monolithic something looks, there are tweakables, there are cracks in the concrete. All we've got to do is push our way in a little bit cheerfully and start making demands and suggestions for something that is livable and doable into the future. So we hope to see some of you next week, Friday, the 8th of July, and keep an eye on the website. And thank you again so much. Take care. We'll see you all soon. Thank you, Kira. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.